My name is Denis Kuvshinov. I'm the head of the research in positive technologies on threat investigation. And today I'd like to discuss with you an interesting group that we've discovered today, the ChamelGang or CamelGang. It is named after the chameleon in English. It is a great little animal that is able to disguise itself amazingly in its surrounding environment. And it's not something new in terms of disguising for a hacker group, but this group has been so effective at disguising itself, which is why this association has been born. But before we are going to talk about the group itself, the gang itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about our PT Expert Security Center. Now, we have a threat intelligence. This is the department that I work in. We also work with malware detection. So we analyze software, we analyze the various techniques that hackers employ and write down technical rules for our sandbox. Apart from malware detection, we also do incident response and do network security. So we write network rules for various softwares, for various techniques the hackers employ. And then all this expertise finds itself inside the programs. And of course, we share part of this expertise with the community. And now let us come back to our chameleons. Today, I'm going to give you a short resume about the gang itself. I'm going to share the incidents that we have investigated, about the tactics and methods that they used in order to hack different companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the software. We're not going to go into the tools in detail. I'm just going to share the unique tools that this gang employs. Then we're going to talk about the network infrastructure. I'm going to share how we have analyzed it and what difficulties have we encountered. I'm going to talk about the victims. I'm going to say who they targeted, where, what industries, and I'm going to share some life hacks which you can use to detect the methods of these gangs. Now, about the group. According to our data, they have started working in 2019. We have clarified this data since we have resolved the report, and we have conducted an extra investigation that led us to believe that this gang is active since 2019. We have conducted 3 investigations of 3 incidents in Russia, but we have over 20 victims worldwide. And generally, this gang is able to act so widely due to the vulnerability of the proxy shell that they have exploited. And this vulnerability has been very instrumental to the gang because their Dorme is an amazing tool for them, and this vulnerability aided them a lot. And of course, the group is characterized by a lot of disguising, and this is something we are going to talk about. We have investigated 3 incidents in Russia, one in an energy company, one in space industry, and one in aerospace industry. All the incidents that we have investigated had something in similar, 3 things in similar. First is the periodic antivirus reaction of Cobalt Strike of antiviruses. Why is this strange? Well, because of the software, when the service was restarted or when the computer was restarted, this was downloaded and administrators were just complaining about some illegitimate activity in the network. So an illegitimate scan of the network, so some weird activity from the domain admins in the nighttime and all these sort of things. During the investigation, we were able to find 2 original vectors. First is the trust relationship vector. So we have seen a data company being hacked, and through it, the companies were able to get into the company where we were invited to investigate the incident. The second vector is exploiting a public-facing application, and the vulnerability in the proxy shell. And the third case, which we've investigated last, we were unable to find where the original vector came from because it's been an old case and there was no remnants left in the network. Now let us look at each of these attacks in more detail. We'll start off with the first case. How were the hackers able to get into the network? Now, org1 and org1 is the daughter company and org2 is the target company. Now, both of these had networks which allowed the hackers to enter into the company from one into another. We had JBoss installed in org2, which the gang was able to find an exploit to. And this is an old exploit from 2017. This was not difficult. They have exploited this vulnerability. They have made their way inside and started exploring the network itself. They were scanning it. They found the users' machines that were running Windows, and they started compromising them. After a certain amount of time, they were able to find themselves in the general network, and they just dump one of the passwords of the admins in the main network of org2, so our first company, the daughter company, the target company. After this, they start researching the network of the second organization, of org1. They compromise many machines. They compromise the machines of users and of administrators. And after a certain time, they find a way of exchange. Here, I'd like to note that they have left Cobalt Strike Beacon on each of the computers they have compromised, and this was done for them to have separate access to the network. So if the admins were starting to defend their machines, then at least one machine would have stayed infected. And if we're talking about UX Exchange, they have used their flagship backdoor back.me. It's not detected by various protection softwares. And why, I'm going to share about this in more detail later. And the entire network was compromised. In the second case, everything was far simpler. We've seen the vulnerability of the proxy shell, and they were able to just exploit this vulnerability and were able to get their way into the network. They started picking up different ISPX shells in order to interact with the system easier, and then they were just uploading their flagman backdoor.me. Now, this incident was found by us ourselves. Nobody addressed us with a request to explore this or to investigate this, and we have found this incident 4 days after he was compromised. In just under a week, we were able to patch and solve everything. And through this time, they were unable to compromise the entire network. We just had one machine of the administrator compromised and 2 servers. Here, I'd like to stop in more detail and talk about the actual vulnerability and how the gang has used it. Now, this vulnerability was patched in March or in April, and then in August in the Blackheart conference, this was talked about to a global audience. In just a week / a week and a half, everybody started exploiting it, and all the vendors started saying that APT gangs started using these exploits and vulnerabilities to get into the network, and our hackers were not an exception to this. Now, this entire chain is necessary to apply the external code through the PowerShell on the server. And this chain consists of 3 vulnerabilities. The first vulnerability allows us to bypass the control of access. We get a backdoor with system rights. After this, there is a second vulnerability that is to do with privileges. And here we need to understand that we have a lowering down of privileges because we're going to later on interact with the mailbox, and any user with a system user rights does not have a mailbox. So here we are going down to a local administrator level, and after that we exploit the third vulnerability, which gives us the PowerShell commandlets. So what were the hackers doing with these commandlets? They were using a public POG, and they have just made it work a little bit better. So they were working with the mailbox itself with the folder drafts. They would get letters into the draft folder, in which they would have a coded IXP shell written as a message. Then they would export this folder with the drafts into a PST format with the ISPX extension into any other folder on the server. Here we have to note that the export is conducted with the table of permutations, so all the data that are inside this PST are going to be coded, which is exactly why the gang used the IPX shell coded, because when we exported the PST file, we had a back-way permutation, and our shell found itself in clean text. So after this, the hackers would just address this IPX shell, and the system would find within this PST file a tag that is to do with the script, and would just run the script. Here on the slide, you can see how this PST file looks like in Outlook. We see that in the draft we have many letters, and this is just the result of exploiting the vulnerabilities, and there are also attachments, and the attachment is the coded ISPX shell. Now, let us talk about the possible scouting that they used. They used the link of the land methods, which are fairly standard. They used MS-17.0.10 vulnerability, which is fairly popular with hackers to get into Windows machines. They used Nmap to scan the machines, and they used a very interesting service called DNS log. Now, this is something I want to talk about in more detail. DNS log can be called a Pinterest service because it is designed for black box testing. Now, what is black box testing? It's where we have access to a certain system. You're able to run certain code on it, but you're not actually getting a response from the system. So you're not getting the results of the commands that you run. So you go into this service, you get a third level domain, And for example, you can link a domain to the 4th level domain, a command that is going to be run on a remote machine. So for example, you ping whoami.domain of the 3rd level and send it to the system. In the interface of this DNS log, you're going to see the executed command whoami, the name of the computer, and the domain of the 3rd level that you've been assigned. Here, we can assume that one of the hackers or many of the hackers is a pen tester. And the last stage of the attack is the exfiltration of the data. Now, we're used to seeing that hackers collect the documents using masks, so they archive them with a password or without a password, and then they send it to the control server through a backdoor or through some utility. In this particular case, the hackers did something more sneaky. They collected documents via a mask, just the same. They would get it into a web server of the compromised organization, and it just came from the outside and picked it up. And of course, they just deleted the archive afterwards. And this is a very unnoticeable technique because we are unable to see a big upload of data to the external servers. We don't see any connections to an external service. We just see that somebody came to our web server through a URL, just picked something up and left. And nobody really monitors this and nobody really watches this. At least not many people do. Now, we looked at the main methods that this gang was using. Now, let us look at the methods that allow the hackers to remain unnoticed within the network. The first is, of course, mimicry. And then the hackers, of course, used the AV bypass. They've used the living off the land techniques and the registry malware. Now, let us talk about each of these points in more detail. We're going to start off with the mimicry. So the mimicry is something they employed in each of the aspects, from the files to the network infrastructure. Now, if we're to talk about the files, they've picked the name of the file so that they would not stand out. They could take an existing file, just change a certain letter in it, and the file goes ready. They could also add the bits of the system, x64, x84, or they could just change the timestamp for the file to not stand out. So we have a list of 5 files, and the 6th file would stand out because of the year. So all of them are 2019, and the other one is 2021. They would just change the timestamp of the file for it to not stand out, and it was less noticeable for admins. Regarding the IIS servers, there it was meant to be registered in a service, and to register the name of the service, they used it from the list. They just copied it. They would, for example, change a letter or add an x64 and x84, and it would not be different from the ones that already existed. Now, regarding the network infrastructure, they use phishing domains that seem like the antivirus providers like McAfee, Kaspersky. They used Microsoft and Google-like names, and this is used by many different hacker groups. And regarding certificates and the common names, they also use the popular vendors, and they also use the certificates from Clopvr, which were trusted. Now, let us look at how they've bypassed the antivirus software. On the Microsoft website, there is a recommendation for AV programs to add certain files and processes as an exception. And this recommendation is put forth for the antivirus to not stop the server from working. So for it not to delete something that is necessary, for it to not just stop a process that is necessary, for everything to just keep working. And within these exceptions, you can find this folder where you have the components of the server located. In our attack, the gang has used the software that is present inside this folder, and the backdoor me is part of the IIS. And so when the admins would scan this with an antivirus, they would not find anything. But after we have asked them to remove the exception from the antivirus servers, then the antivirus was able to locate these files and to delete them. Now, let us look at the living of the land techniques. We're not going to talk about some default techniques like SHT, PowerShell. We're going to talk about something more detailed and interesting. In the Microsoft system, there are pre-installed services in the system that do not have files in the system for them. So we have a service, and when we launch the service, the registry searches for the file, the name of the file, but this file does not actually exist. In order for these files to appear, you need to install additional software, and this is what our hackers use. They were not creating new servers. They were using the existing services. They were just giving the directory to a file with the necessary name, just restarting the service, and our malware would launch. And in our case, the malware was Beacon Loader, which then launched the CobbleStrike beacon. In general, this technique is fairly well known and fairly known for a long time. This has been written about in 2014, 2015, but lately we've not seen for hackers to actually use this method, as in of late. And a last interesting method where they were using malware in the registry, where they were holding coded data in the registry, and the beacon loader, instead of, for example, running it from the drive, it would run it from the registry. And they've used this technique only in 2019. So in the incidents that we have investigated that are newer from this year, this technique is not being used. Now, why they have stopped using this? Well, perhaps because it is easier found by various security and defense software. Now, let us analyze the malware code. We're just going to talk about the unique tools for this group. Well, let's look at all the tools that they've employed. The most popular tool that this group used is CobbleStrike Beacon. We've seen a lot of different CobbleStrike beacons. We've seen SMB beacons, HTTPS beacons, DNS beacons, combined beacons, and everything along these lines. Interesting details that are worth noting here are that in each organization that we have investigated the incident, the beacon had different watermarks. So within one organization, the beacon would have a single watermark, but within different organizations, the watermark would be different. And here we can assume that there are many hacker groups and that they're just using similar malware, but the methods used state the opposite. They're the same in each case, and we can safely say that this is one organized group acting. Now, let us look to the unique malware. We'll start off with the beacon loader, and I've already told you about the leaving of land methods when they use legitimate services to launch their malicious software. And this also concerns beacon loader. They would just restart the service. The beacon loader would start the SVC host process. And it's interesting because the beacon loader had some checks where it would actually be launched by the SVC host process, because some of the investigators launch beacon loader in this way, hoping that it's actually going to be loaded in by beacon CobbleStrike. After that, the beacon loader would either run the malware from the registry or from the hard drive, and that's it. The beacon CobbleStrike in itself was encoded by IS. So the key was taken from an encrypted set of data, and then it would take the MD5, and that would, for example, be the key. And in this case, this data was transformed via math operations, but here it was taken an MD5 again, and it would be the key once again. In one of the old versions of the beacon loader from 2019, we were able to find a PDP file which can be judged as evidence that the group was still perfecting their malicious software, because later on we were unable to note these sort of files because they would not leave such traces later on. And now let us look at their flagmanship backdoor, the DoorMe. Now, why is a DoorMe called that? Fairly simply, they used this name in the code and we liked it, and so we took it. The DoorMe itself is an IIS module, as I've already said. It is becoming part of the server. And the code base is actually taken from the official Microsoft repository of code for IIS modules, and anybody who wants can get their own module running, write a code for it, and make it a part of the service. Now, this backdoor is a passive backdoor. Now, what is a passive backdoor? We're used to seeing a backdoor trying to get access to the control and command server, trying to get some data. But in this case, the backdoor is not going anywhere. We're just waiting for somebody to connect given certain conditions. And we have seen two versions of this backdoor. One, simple light backdoor with a low amount of commands, and the other one is a heavier one. There we have seen more commands being run, and this is how they're different. And you can see how you can install any module on the IIS module on a server. This command is given on the slide lower. You just run from cmd install module, name of the module, and just the directory of the module. And this is how they were installing this module. So they were not just placing it in a folder. This is something that had to be installed. And what did this backdoor do after it was launched? The first thing it did, it tried to download the default phrase from the registry. And this phrase in every incident was absent from the registry, and then it took a different phrase from its standard list of phrases. It would take it sounds obscene, is the fuck me phrase, and it would take the MD5, and that would be the route of communication between the hacker and this backdoor. Now, this backdoor is passive. It is not actually trying to get anywhere. It's just waiting for somebody to connect, and for the hacker to check that the server is compromised and that nobody was deleting the backdoor, would just send a correctly phrased GET request with the title and with the session equal to and whatever the MD5 from the phrase would be. So the dormie would receive this package and would say that everything is good, okay, we're good to work. And it would send it works back with the HTML tags. And the hacker understands that now they can actually work. And then he would send an encrypted command into the dormie. The command was encrypted by iOS, and this was the half, and the encryption key was the half of the phrase via MD5, which I've spoken about earlier. In the first dormie, we've seen 6 commands. We copy a file, use an exe, change the timestamp, give us the host name, the directory, and so on. The second version, we see 5 more commands, but we see that they're more of an informational. So give me more information on the file, its attributes, its timestamps. Give me the information on the processes. So these commands are fairly simple. And so we have looked at the malicious software of the group, and now let me talk about its infrastructure. The infrastructure itself is fairly complicated. Now, what do I mean by that? It was difficult for us to find new control servers because there was no interconnectivity. Because we're used to, when we have a domain, it is hooked to an IP, and then to this IP has another domain. This domain has subdomains, and then you can just follow the trace. In this case, we had nothing of the sort, because the gang was hiding behind a Cloudflare. We had to find new domains by using SSL certificates, and here Yarn helped us a lot. Now, regarding the certificates, they were trying to make them mimic legitimate services like Microsoft, Google, jQuery, and generally they were all different. They had a different ASH256. But sometimes they would give us a present, and we would find servers with the same certificates, and then we could just look what domains are present on this IP. So we were able to find new domains precisely by using this method. And when we're talking about certificates on Cloudflare, when you're hosting your domains on Cloudflare, when you're purchasing the service from them, they have a free service that gives you an SSL certificate. In the browser, it is going to look valid. So for example, an admin will want to check this domain. Is it a phishing domain or is it a real domain? He's going to access the site and is going to look at it and is going to say, okay, the certificate is legit, everything is good, because all the domains were very similar to legitimate domains to start off with. And talking about the YARM technology, which helped us to identify the control servers. JARM or YARM is a technology that is based on the fingerprint of TLS handshakes for the servers. So there is a certain database of these YARMs which has been done before us, which we could compare the YARMs that we find with. And in their majority, the YARMs would align with the Cobalt Strike YARMs, and this continued building our confidence in the fact that these servers belong to the gang that we're tracing here. And now let us do this little attribution here. On here we have the group activity on the network, and we see that the entire activity took place during off hours, so from 1 a.m. till 9 a.m. And we can assume that hackers are not from our region, so they're probably somewhere east of here. And regarding their activities on the days of the week, here we have seen that the hackers did not work on the weekends. They always worked on work days. And we can also assume that the client was just turning off their machines for the hackers to have no ability to do anything. But we can also assume that hackers were working during their work hours and their work days. Now, let us talk about the victims. Victims have targeted organizations worldwide in North America, in Central Europe, in Central East Asia, in East Asia. The group had no preferred region of operation. It is also interesting that it had no preferred industry. They would attack the government sectors, energy companies, space companies, insurance companies, various educational institutions, everybody without any sort of division. Also, the hackers did not monetize their activities. They did not steal crypto wallets. They did not steal passwords from bank cards. They were interested in information. So they were spying in essence. And now allow me to give you a number of recommendations. Here, we can give some normal recommendations like install an antivirus, even though it's not going to really help, but like update your servers, don't allow your accountant to have a admin access level, but you know about all these things. This is something that is general and broad, but here I'd like to give you some particular recommendations that you can actually protect and prevent the activities of these groups. Is first, you need to look for the 4688 event with the launch of the app CMD. You have to monitor that because that is what it allows the IaaS model to install the Dormy. And in the incidents that we have investigated, the admins of the network were not working with the IaaS modules. They were not writing modules. They were not doing anything with it. So if you're not doing anything with the modules yourself, you can actually make sure you detect this event when it takes place. The second is the detection of the suspicious processes under the w3wp.exe processes. When this Dormy is installed, there are certain operations through cmd.exe, and on the server, this operation is going to be run under this process, w3wp.exe. So if you see that w3wp starts launching some processes like PowerShell, SMHT, and so on, and this is also going to be a detection point that you can use in your further investigation. And another recommendation, make sure that your IaaS modules are not a part of the exceptions for your antivirus. Generally, it should not bring your servers down because all the modules are there by default. They're not going to be stopped by the antivirus. But if you are doing modules yourself that you're actually using on your servers, then this folder can remain as part of the exceptions. Okay, colleagues, I think that this is it for my part of the report, and you can look at the full version of our report by scanning this QR code that you see on the slide right now. In the report, you will find the outcomes of our products, the indicators that you're able to check on our network, and the next presentation is going to be given by the Chief Virus Analytic, Dmitry Kupin from the IB Group. Thank you very much for your attention.